I was hoping a few might stay, and you have. How about that? That's great. Good to be with you. I think since I last saw most of you, I've been on a bit of a journey, probably in more ways than one, actually. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning, and I hope I'm not going to get ticked off by the leaders. I might be taken to one side later. No, I'm only joking. I'm very much going to focus on the subject for this morning, but in a slightly different way. So I've used a little bit of sort of artistic license, really. So I hope that's all right. So I'm looking at Deb, I'm looking at Sam, and I'm looking at, where's Ed? Where's he gone? Oh, he's at the back there. He's definitely, he's looking a bit severe. He's getting a bit worried what I'm going to do. But don't worry, we're all right. I know, I realise that. I know exactly what that means, Ed, so don't worry. But we'll see where we go. But those of you who know me realise that I'm a bit of an old fart these days. You're not supposed to laugh, Lee. What's all that about? You don't have to agree. So the difficulty I have is that I've never got used to bifocals, and I have to do my Morecambe and Wise impression and swap over glasses every now and again. So that's I can read there and see you, and I got this other pair of glasses here that means I can read my notes. Oh, you've all gone dim. That's probably a good thing because I can't see what reaction I'm getting. So, and I can't see Ed doing that, which is probably even better. Now we're going to check hopefully, the technology's working. How about that? So, as I said earlier, we are in the fifth of a series of 6 in the book of Exodus. It's an amazing story, and in many ways, it's actually a bit of an epic, really of God's deliverance of His people, the Israelites, from Egypt to the Promised Land via the wilderness, from that sense of slavery into freedom. They've been in Egypt for over 400 years, much of it as slaves, and then Moses is called, and he arrives. And God's chosen man brings that challenge to Pharaoh, the leader in Egypt, to lead the Israelites out of captivity. It's a journey, as we've already heard, that has its ups and downs. But it's also a journey which reflects God's heart for the Israelites and His longing for relationship. And as we reflect on it, it also is a story that's full of imagery that resonates with and reflects God's amazing blueprint for deliverance of the whole world through Jesus, from death to life, from slavery to freedom, from hopelessness to hope. It's a story that dates back around about 3,500 years, but I think it's as relevant today as it's ever been, and I hope we'll be able to unpack a little bit about that today. So it's the 5th week. In week 1, we heard about God's plan and purpose. The Israelites are enslaved, but God raises up Moses, and God had a plan and a purpose for Moses. Moses wasn't quite that keen necessarily to go along with God's plan, but eventually did, and he was used and empowered to do that. And indeed, in the same way that God had a plan for Moses, he has a plan for us too. Week 2, God's call. Moses is called directly by God. And as I said, he wasn't so keen immediately to respond, but he was commissioned by God to go to challenge Pharaoh and to lead the people to freedom. And that sense of call of God on his life gave him that authority to be able to go and to do what God had called him to do. Then in week 3, under the title The Great Escape, we saw the amazing way that the people are allowed to go after a series of plagues. And we see in that story a wonderful picture, as it were, of how we too can experience that sense of freedom through Jesus. Last week, under the title Trust and Disappointment, not in Sam, I hasten to add, but Sam spoke and focused on the story, that part of the story about crossing the Red Sea. And talked about how the fact that the Israelites really struggled at times to trust God in the context of fear and disappointment. You know, our journey can sometimes be like that we can face areas of fears in our life or even disappointment. But it's at that point that we can experience too the reality of God with us. This week, loosely under the title of God's Instructions, we reach chapters 19 and 20 of Exodus. And this actually happens quite soon. It's only 2 or 3 months after the Israelites had left Egypt. They were now free. They were free from the slavery and tyranny of Egypt. And they were free too from the constraints and the restrictions that would have brought. So, with a very slick change of glasses, we're going to read some bits out of quite a chunk, actually. We did this last week, and I make no apology for doing the same. We're going to just take some sections from Exodus 19 and 20. Follow it in your Bible, but also it'll be on the screen. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. This went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything that the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. A little bit further on in Exodus 19, goes on like this. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us, put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." The Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. And then into the next chapter. And God spoke all these words, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son, daughter, or nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen." but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. That was quite a long reading, but it just helps to provide a little bit of the context. But what's all this about, you might ask yourselves? The Israelites had lost their freedom for hundreds of years. They'd now been freed. But within less than 100 days of their escape, God seemed to be putting in place what appeared to be rules and regulations, so-called commandments. How does that work? What's God doing in all of this? Why can't they just be free without rules? And in many ways, the use of the word commandments is in many ways unhelpful. The literal translation of the word that's used in the original is words. This is actually God speaking words into the lives of the people he loved so passionately. This wasn't really about rules and regulations at all. It was actually about relationship. God providing a framework for the people to live life to the full in their newly found freedom, sending out a strong foundation for their future. And throughout history, interestingly, the truths that are tied up in Exodus 19 and 20 and other parts of some of the laws that were given at the time have actually provided the basis for sound legal systems. And they're still there in modern day legislation in relation to personal and property rights. Every society needs these sorts of frameworks, those boundaries. They're there for our good, for us to be able to live in freedom and to enjoy relationship. Imagine a game of football without any rules. It would be chaos. A bit like Ashton Gate, really, on a Saturday afternoon. Anyway, any City supporters here? Oh dear, sorry. No. Forgive me. It's probably not so good at Rovers either, but anyway. Imagine going out later after we've left this morning and getting into your car without the benefit of a highway code and related laws to create the framework and boundaries to travel safely. Now, Marion, my wife at the back, would probably say, well, that's how you drive most of the time, so what's changed? But in all seriousness, these words from God, these commandments, were there to create more freedom, not to crush or constrain. And I think at the core of these 10 words, I'm going to call them that rather than commandments, is relationship. And if you look at them, the first 3 are about our relationship with God. The 4th focuses on the importance of the Sabbath, the day of rest that we hopefully can set aside once each week as a pattern. And that 4th commandment about the Sabbath, in a sense, provides a bridge. It's a place of connection between us and God to the other 6 remaining commandments, which relate to our relationship to others. I think it's just an amazing structure. And the structure has both a vertical element. It also has a horizontal element in terms of our relationship to God, but also our relationship to others. And when you take a vertical element and you introduce a horizontal element, what do you get? A cross. You get a cross. And you know what? I believe that the heart of this is a picture of God's extraordinary love for us. This was expressed 1,500 years before Jesus came as the Messiah. And 1,500 years before Jesus, as we've reflected earlier, would die on a cross that we could enter fully into the freedom of knowing God as Father. And we have a Father God who loves us unconditionally. No other faith in the world has relationship at its heart. Other faiths have at their centre religion, rules, regulations, but they're not about freedom to experience love and relationship. They're about trying to work hard for something that God actually offers as a free gift of grace. You know, God's heart burns. It longs for relationship with every one of us. We're designed, we're created for relationship with God, but also with each other. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our makeup. It's part of who we are. And that's at the heart of these 10 words or commandments. If we go forward into the New Testament, into the Gospels, those stories that we read of Jesus' time on earth, we find numerous times where the religious and legal leaders of the time tried to trick Jesus, to catch him out. And we see a number of examples in Matthew 22. I'm going to just read one particular one if we can. It says this: hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." And if you read the context, you'll actually note that this is the fourth time that the religious and legal leaders tried to catch him out. In this case, it's a lawyer that's trying to do it. And to them, those guys at the time, religious leaders, they very much saw the laws and the regulations that were set out in the Old Testament were to be adhered to at all cost. Rather than providing a framework of living in freedom, they'd become an excuse for legalism and judgmentalism. And to try and catch Jesus out, to pick out one particular commandment as greatest, was to imply that the others weren't as important. But Jesus gives an answer that wonderfully encapsulates all 10. And at the core of his answer is relationship and love. Love for God and love for your neighbor. And here we see the commandments, those words from God, beautifully summarized by Jesus in those two elements again: vertical love for God, horizontal love for each other, and only days before Jesus himself will be taken and nailed to a cross. But you know, there's a challenge here, because if you look at the answer that Jesus gave, it appears on the face of it that he has set the bar just incredibly high. How on earth, literally, can we be expected to love like that? How can we be expected to love like that? Let me let you into a little secret. Well, it's actually not really a secret, actually a fundamental truth. And it's found a little bit later in the New Testament in a letter that was written by one of Jesus' disciples, John. And John is actually often referred to as a disciple that Jesus loved. He'd seen and experienced at first hand the love of Jesus, God's Son. So this wasn't theory, this wasn't just theology or whatever. This was a truth that had been learned by John in the sharing the journey with Jesus. Let's take a quick look just at a couple of verses that John writes from that book. It says here, "And so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in him, in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we may have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love." This is the important phrase. We love because he first loved us. We love because he first loved us. You see, living in the reality and fullness of God's love for us creates in us the ability to love him and others. The more we understand and comprehend the enormity of God's love for us, the greater is our capacity to love him. And when we journey with God, living in the reality of his love, day by day, we find that it transforms the way that we can reciprocate that love to him, but also in turn to others. Relationships are two-way. It's about sharing the journey together. And those 10 commandments, those 10 words, no longer are a burden. They're words of love. They're words of freedom that we can thrive in. You know, we have a fundamental need to be loved, to be appreciated, and to be understood. It's who we are. We're created in the image of God for relationship, every one of us. And in today's society, we seem to be looking everywhere else for the answer to those key needs that we have, to be loved, to be accepted, and to be understood, except to the source of that love, the ultimate source of that love, that unconditional love, God himself. Just over a week ago, I returned from a 3-week business trip to Australia and New Zealand. Hate to make you jealous. Actually, Australia hadn't been a great place, to be frank. So it was interesting to see it at first hand. I've done that trip a good number of times, and in many levels I enjoy those trips, and I'm very privileged to be able to do them. They're busy though. There's lots of travel, lots of meetings, lots of queuing at airports. But this time I felt something within me saying that I needed to take some time out amongst all the noise and distractions of a busy schedule. So, you're going to laugh here. So I decided that I would go to Tasmania for the weekend, as you do. You know, why not? Anyway, so I thought I'd never been, always fancied going, and actually, seriously, something in me said it would be good to do. Now, it was actually quite a journey. I had to go from Brisbane, which is way up, via Sydney to Tasmania. Now, I have to say, I have to confess here, I'm not sure Greta Thunberg would be that impressed. I can just sense some of you are thinking here, you know, green footprint, all of that, carbon. Did you go by boat? Sadly not. Now, I probably should have done, Rich, Frank. So, anyway, confessions, but there you go. So 3 weeks ago, I found myself, oh dear, in a wooden hut up in the Cradle Mountains of northwestern Tasmania on my own. Now, this is going to make you really jealous because that's the view I had. So there I was completely alone, and oddly, for some reason, this is an odd one, my phone wouldn't work. Seriously, I don't understand that. Now I think Ed's going to, yeah, I thought you might just, yeah. My phone didn't work, and it always works. For some reason, it didn't work. I had a signal, but it just wouldn't work. And it was very, very odd. I told no one where I was going. And on a Sunday morning, on my own, I set out up in the mountains, you can see them, for a long hike. If there'd been an accident, no one would have known. And I had no way of communicating the outside world. Now, I have to say, this isn't necessarily a particularly good lesson in mountain safety. So let's just get this straight. So I'm not saying this, you should follow this example. But I had just finished reading this book, which a number of you might have read, which is actually an extraordinary book. It's quite a catchy title. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, written by a guy called John Mark Comer. And quite frankly, it had blown me away. I'd literally finished reading it the night before. Just blown me away. It was a life-changing read. I think I heard Ed say exactly the same last week to me. And I recommend it to you all. If you live a busy life, and even if you don't live a busy life, I'd recommend the book. In his mid-30s, Comer was the leader of a megachurch in the US. Thousands in his congregation, preaching at 6 services on a Sunday, and then burnout. We couldn't do it anymore. We had to let it all go. And the book talks very openly, very candidly, about issues that impact on all of us in terms of the busyness and modern-day issues of life. But it also provides some really helpful practical advice on how to shape our lives in a way that makes more time to experience the freedom of relationship with God and with others across 4 themes: silence and solitude, the importance of Sabbath, simplicity and slowing. So here I am 3 Sundays ago, after a 2-hour climb, found myself on top of a mountain in solitude on a Sabbath. So I was sort of getting there. And over that time, God spoke very clearly into my life about a number of things. Some are very personal. In particular, though, there were issues around the importance of solitude, not isolation. This is about solitude, but also taking time out one day a week to enjoy Sabbath rest. Now, this is interesting because I found myself, I hadn't realized at the time, I found that I was on top of a mountain that was called Marion's Lookout. Now, that is very odd. Some of you will know that that's my wife's name. So how about that? Again, reflecting on those vertical and horizontal relationships, there I was, having the privilege of being able to commune with a God who loves me unconditionally, more than I can imagine, but also being reminded of the person who knows me best, but yet still loves me in a way that's truly undeserved. Actually, I quite like her as well, by the way, just in case you wondered. And while I was there were 2 particular things that struck me, partly informed by Comer's book. Firstly, the fact that we live under the delusion that we're better connected than ever with this thing and with everything else that we've got that's electronic. In reality, we have lost the art of relationship and communicating, and I sense that we're becoming more isolated than ever. I mention isolation, not solitude. This is a tool that I think makes us more isolated than ever, and there's a delusion about that. We've lost the ability to appreciate the simple joy of relating to others without the need for electronic aids. And it can be so bad. How many of us have seen a family in a cafe and every single member of the family on their iPhone, a chance to communicate and have quality time? I've done it. I've been there, with the grandkids. No, I just sneak a thing, just check Leeds United are winning. They usually are. But, Marion will, if I hadn't said that, she would have done, actually. Just so, none of us are perfect. It's so sad. We have those opportunities and we don't take them. Secondly, we live in the delusion that we have more freedom than ever to be ourselves. In reality, we seem to be trapped into conforming with every new trend, forced to meet the expectation that society places on us, seeking to live further and further outside the boundaries that God has put in place, and that are intended fundamentally to give us the freedom that we crave for. It's perverse. We've lost that ability to be the person that God created us to be. We're always looking for something else, some new trend that in the end takes us further and further away from our true identity. The truth is, when we seek to live as God intended us to live and to be the person that He intended us to be, that's where we find the peace and joy that we so crave for. I do want to stress one thing, though, and this again is a fundamental truth. You don't have to fly to Tasmania to connect with God. In fact, you don't necessarily have to climb a mountain or even a modest hill to get to do the same. All of us can find those times during the day and whatever we're doing, just to take time out simply to enjoy a little bit of two-way communication with God. He's always there, trust me. He's always there. You sound too busy. Well, perhaps that's true, but is everything we're busy doing always that essential? Perhaps some of that time we spend watching television, on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter, whatever it might be, is it always as essential as we might think it is? I bring that challenge to myself. I'm not just bringing it to you. Taking time out to enjoy a relationship with God and those relationships with others is life-changing for us, but it's also life-changing for those around us. We are coming into land, Ed, if you're a bit worried about time. Actually, that takes me back. I feel I ought to sort of click my belt and stick my bag under the seat in front and just put my seat forward because we're coming into land. I did that quite over those 3 weeks. But let me leave you with a couple of thoughts. If I were to ask you what's the Bible all about, I wonder what answer you'd give. I was lying awake the other night. In fact, I've been lying awake most nights this week. Jet lag is a wonderful thing. And I had this simple thought, and I'm sure not the only one that's had this simple thought. An alternative title for the Bible could be The Greatest Love Story Ever Told. The core of the Bible is a consistent narrative of a God who loves us and simply wants a relationship with us from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation. So much so that he sends his Son to bring a message of hope. And as we reflected earlier in communion, it's his sacrifice on the cross that gives us access into relationship with the Father. Free access to the Father. No need for any more a priest to go up on our behalf as it was in the Old Testament. No need to stay at the bottom of the mountain in fear while Moses goes up on our behalf. No need for any of that. Just relationship. There's a great song that we often sing. I'm probably running out of time, so I won't read it. But you'll recognise this amazing song that speaks of God's love. And in the refrain, it talks about God's reckless love. You know, when I Googled to find those words, I found a whole bunch of people who were complaining about the fact that the writer had used the word reckless. Should be wondrous or some other name, you know, that God couldn't be reckless. And you know, I think we can use that word, reckless, because it gives to me a sense of a God that loves us so much he'll do anything, even send his Son. And I love the story of the prodigal son. I think we referred to it earlier. The father was reckless, wasn't he? He was looking out for his son to come back. And as soon as he saw him, he ran, robes flying everywhere. I imagine, you know, jumping over the fence, foot in the cowpat, whatever, dust everywhere, because he wanted to get to the son that he loved and put his arms around him. That's a picture of the love that our Heavenly Father has for us and how he feels about you and me, every single one of us in this room today. That's how he feels. Let me finish. I think we've got time. Very quickly. Let me finish by allowing someone else, I said too much, someone else to share a little story. I first came across a guy called Charlie Mackesy a few years ago, and I didn't actually realise that I had. We had this amazing picture at home. Many of you will have it. It's a beautiful picture, a beautiful reflection of the prodigal son. And with a father just with his arms around it. There are two versions, prodigal son, prodigal daughter. I hope that's not unbiblical. Amazing picture. Some of you may have seen it. It's extraordinary. And there are various versions that he's done. He's done sculptural versions as well. This man, Charlie Mackesy, in his early years, for many years, he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. He certainly didn't believe in a God that loved him and wanted a relationship with him. And then on his journey of life, he encountered God. He discovered an unconditional love and a grace that was for him personally, that blew him away. He's since written a book. Some of you may have seen it. It's called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. Has anybody read it? Everybody should read it. It is an extraordinary book. You can read this twice in 30 minutes. It's one of the most extraordinary, profound books I have ever read. And when you read it, you'll know what I mean. It's an extraordinary book. It's not a theological book. It's very brief, but it is extraordinary. So I thought I might want to share a little story. So if we can play it, I hope this works. But literally we're going to finish and I'll pray at the end. And I hope we've got a little bit of time for worship. But watch this.
The last story I'll tell you is about a friend of mine who is he's a hospital chaplain. And he goes around, chatting to people who are in hospital beds. And there was one guy who was in for a long time, and he said every time he walked past the bed, the guy would be in bed, and he'd just do that at the vicar as he went past. Every time. Whee! Whee! Oh, there he is. All the time. So he'd go in there, and he got used to it. He just got used to that. So every time he usually didn't, but he just smiled and expect that. And then one particular day, he walked past, and there was no that. He was just lying there. And as he was walking past, he said, "Oi." And my friend looked at him and said, "Yes." And he said, "Can I have a word?" He said, "Sure." He said, "All right, I know I'm being rude and everything, but, I would just love to chat to you about why you wear that white thing, what you believe." He said, "Sure, what would you like to know?" He said, "Well, come on then, tell me." So he told him about Jesus, he told him about grace, about forgiveness, about the love of God, about the relationship you can have with him, all the basic things, and that you can pray to him. And he said, "Well, how do you pray then?" He said, "Well, it's pretty simple actually." He said, "Well, how do you pray then?" And he said, "Well," and he got off his chair and said, "Okay, that's your bed, there you are, there's a chair. Now you just imagine that Jesus is sitting in this chair and he's just loving you permanently. He knows you. And you can talk to him, so you can just say what you like." He said, "So what would you say?" And he said, "Probably say that I'm pretty scared." Well, you can tell him that. Very fragile man. And he said, "Well, what else would you say?" "That I've effed up my life and I'm sorry." Great. That's honest. What else would you say? To know. Well, you can be in silence, but just remember he's there. Just keep talking, keep talking. You can listen if you like, but just keep talking. Remember that you're loved. Remember that he died for you. Remember that you're free. Basic stuff. So he said, "Thanks. I can see why you're a vicar. Sounds good." And then my friend got up and left. He was there a few days later, walked past the bed, empty. Spoke to the nurses, "Where is he? Have you moved him to another ward?" "No, I'm afraid." The staff nurse said, "No, I'm afraid he died actually 2 days after you were last here." And he went, "Oh, okay." And he said, "That's a shame." And she said, "Yeah, but when you left the last time, he was all really, he was kind of bouncy in bed and kept telling us what you told him about the chair and this Jesus thing." And he said, "Oh, that's good." And he said, yeah, he was like really overwhelmingly pleased about it all. And he said, "Good." And then he got a bit sort of, so he started walking off. And the staff nurse said, "Oh, by the way, one other thing before you go, you should probably know, and it's a bit strange to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you anyway, that when we found him in the morning after he died, he was found leaning out of his bed. His hips were on the bed, and his chest was on the, you'd pull the chair, his chest was on the chair, and his arms were wrapped around the back of the chair. And he died like that. And of course, my friend just started weeping. Because he realized that this guy, he'd understood the whole thing. He got it completely in a nutshell. The thing we struggle with all our lives, he'd understood that he was loved. The reason why he exists was to love and be loved, and that he could rest his whole weight and his fragility on this Jesus, because you can put your burden on him, and he will sustain you because he loves you.
I sense that some of you may be struggling to believe that God really does love you. You've messed up. You may even struggle to feel that you are in any way lovable. You may have a model of a father's love from your childhood that's incredibly negative and unhelpful. You never experienced a father's love. Indeed, perhaps quite the opposite, and that colours your view of God as Father. You may be struggling relating to others, friends, family, work colleagues. The concept of loving them is just alien. You've been hurt, let down, and just can't bring yourself to relate to them, let alone love them. You may struggle with understanding the idea of loving others as you love yourself. Why? Because you have a very negative view of yourself. You may see nothing of worth in yourself, and therefore you might even hate aspects of the way you look or feel about yourself. The concept of loving others as yourself is therefore not helpful. You may never have encountered God's love before because, perhaps like you're not even sure there's a God there at all. Well, let me tell you this morning that God longs to reach out to you and to take you in his arms so that you can feel his heartbeat for you and sense the warmth of his love. He's that dad running to you with his arms open wide. The good news is that you don't have to fly anywhere, climb a mountain, get someone else to speak to God on your behalf. You don't have to email, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter, or any other means of digital communication. Simply reach out to him. He's there. So, Father, thank you that you love us so much so that you sent your son Jesus to die for us. Thank you for your amazing, reckless love for each of us and for me. Thank you that as we reach out to you, you're there and you long to dwell within us by your Spirit. Amen.